Hello, and let's welcome Dr. Jordan Grumet again for talking about his book, The Purpose Code. Jordan, just to start off with, why don't you give us a brief introduction of who you are and how you came to, be an author and a doctor and everything.
Well, first and foremost, thank you guys for having me again. My story starts when I was literally 7 years old. My father was a doctor. I wanted to be just like him, and he died suddenly. And as most little kids do, they see the world through the lens of their own responsibility. So I figured my dad died because I had done something wrong. And cosmically, I thought I could fix that by becoming a doctor like him. That became my sole sense of purpose, my sole sense of identity, and I did it, right? I went to college and medical school and I studied really, really hard. And I ended up being a practicing general medicine physician, but I burned out really, really quick. I found that I wasn't enjoying what I was doing. I was working really, really hard, but not really feeling like I was making a difference. And because of that, one day I actually received a book in the mail from a guy named, hold on for a second, from a guy named Jim Dolly, who wrote a book called The White Coat Investor. And I had a medical blog at the time, and he wanted me to review his book for my medical blog. And it was all about personal finance and financial independence. I realized after reading his book, I was financially independent. I could leave medicine, this thing that was burning me out, which was really exciting, until I realized that I had no idea who I was or what I wanted to do with my life. That led to a period of years of slowly getting rid of things I didn't like in medicine and building a life outside of medicine, which started with personal finance, eventually blogging, and then podcasting. By the time I hit around 2018, the only thing in medicine I was still doing was hospice work, working with the terminally ill. I found that I liked doing that. I would do it even if people weren't paying me for it. So I kept doing that, but that opened up my schedule. And through podcasting and talking about personal finance, I realized that I was talking to all these experts on my podcast, all these authors, entrepreneurs, financial independence people, and they all could tell me how to make money. But what they couldn't tell me is what that means to our lives. How do I live a better life after I've made that money? What is my real why? And I started finding those answers actually from my hospice patients. And my hospice patients, when they were dying, they would talk about their regrets, the things that they never got to do. And it helped inform my decisions and my conversations with my podcast crew, with entrepreneurs and the people interested in financial independence. And I wrote a book called Taking Stock, which was what the dying could teach us about money and life. And after publishing that book, Taking Stock, where I talked a lot about purpose and identity as a precursor to figuring out our finances, a lot of people came up to me and said, you know what? You keep on telling me to find my sense of purpose, but I don't know what purpose really is. I can't find it, and it makes me anxious and I feel lost. And that made me do a deep dive into purpose. And I realized that purpose both is really important because it helps with our sense of health, happiness, and longevity. But also, a large number of people get something called purpose anxiety, the fact that purpose actually stresses them out when they can't seem to find what their one purpose in life is. And so that led to my second book, The Purpose Code, to try to work on that purpose paradox. How can it be both the most important thing and yet cause us a huge amount of anxiety and stress?
So, Jordan, I absolutely love taking style, and I liked this book as well. Some terms that come up over and over again in this book are meaning, purpose, and happiness. Can you give us a brief definition and so we're all on the same page, and then maybe break down what you're calling little p purpose and big P purpose?
Certainly. So first and foremost, I think happiness is the easiest one, right? We have all these kind of conversations about happiness, and there are all sorts of debates on whether it exists or not. But generally, happiness is that state of contentment, feeling like we're doing what we're supposed to in life and feeling good about it. And actually, I think happiness comes from meaning and purpose. So in the book, I say meaning plus purpose equals happiness. A lot of people confuse meaning and purpose and actually think they're interchangeable, but I really don't think they are. Meaning is actually about our past, and it's how we cognitively think about the things we've gone through. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Happy people tend to tell themselves a heroic story about their past. Like they probably had difficult things, they had traumas, but those traumas helped them become a better person and got them to where they are today. That's how a happy person thinks. On the other hand, usually unhappy people think more of a victim type story. Like bad things happened to them, and because of it, they could never get ahead. And that's why they never achieved what they wanted. And so, meaning is really about the past. Purpose is much more about the present and future. It is why we do the things we do, but it's very action oriented. So purpose is about the activities we do today and tomorrow that fill us up. And really, you need both meaning and purpose to get to happiness. What I found, believe it or not, through writing this book and doing a lot of research is that most people get stuck on meaning. They don't resolve some of those issues of their past. They don't feel like they were ever enough. And so they have a lot of trouble pursuing purpose because they're trying to prove their existence, prove their sense of enough by achieving things or by doing things in the present and future. And it just doesn't work that well. They have to go back and really resolve some of those issues of meaning in their past. Once you do that, you start having a sense of enough, like, okay, bad things happened to me in my past, but I was good enough. I was able to overcome them. I've now got to the present and I'm doing well and I'm going after a sense of doing things that feel purposeful. The big question a lot of people have is, well, what really is purpose and how do I find it? And I don't like this word find because I think we actually create it. But I think the reason why there's a duality, why purpose both serves us, helps us feel healthy and happy, but also can give us anxiety is that we typically look at purpose wrong. We think of it as one thing, but it's probably more likely two things. One of the things, what I call big P purpose, probably causes a lot of disappointment in our lives. And the other, what I call little p purpose, probably actually causes more of that happiness, that health, and longevity. So the question is, what is the difference? Well, big P purpose is what I think traditionally people think purpose is. It's this big, audacious thing that we feel we have to achieve to have a huge amount of impact. Usually it's very goal oriented. Like, I want to become a billionaire, or I want to be president of the United States, or I want to be a major league baseball player. The problem with big, audacious purpose is it's difficult. A lot of times we don't have agency to actually achieve these things. Like, no matter how much I want to be a billionaire, I might have been born at the wrong time to the wrong parents in the wrong place. Maybe I don't have the skills I need to build a business or do these things. Sometimes it's out of our control. So if we don't have agency to do those things, I want to be a major league baseball player, but what if I just don't have the genetics, right? What if I don't have the height? What if I don't have the strength? No matter how hard I try, if you're not the right person at the right time doing the right things and happen to have a lot of luck, you end up more often disappointed. So big P purpose is very much all or nothing, and it's very easy to fail. And because of that, it's really kind of scarcity mindset oriented. Only a few people are going to become president in the world, and the rest, if that's what they really want to do, are going to fail and feel bad at it. Now, contrast that to little p purpose. Little p purpose is not worried about goals, it's much more worried about process. In other words, are you enjoying the thing you're doing regardless of the goal? So instead of being scarce, it's very abundant. Like, there are a million different things we could go out and do that would fill us up. They're very hard to fail because pretty much succeeding is just showing up and doing the thing. And so it's much more achievable and we have much more agency. And so what I found is that people tend to be more happy when they focus on little p purpose. It tends to fill them up more, whereas they tend to be more disappointed when they focus on big P purpose.
In the book, you give a couple of examples of how maybe people can go about finding their purpose. Like maybe you want to go through some of those. So I mean, just like as you were talking about big purpose versus little p purpose, I feel like I previously had a girlfriend that would criticize me for doing exactly what you just said. Like I would have these very outlandish goals that oftentimes I would never or have not yet met. And it's like almost my entire identity is tied to those. And I would become so like distraught when I couldn't do it. So I guess like what you're saying just very much resonates with my own like life, as you're saying it and as I was reading it. But yeah, maybe just some of the examples of how to find your, I guess, little p purpose.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about that. And just one comment on what you said is the problem is when you start losing the joy of doing what you're doing because you're not meeting a goal, and when you place all the importance and joy and sense of purposefulness on the goal, again, you're setting yourself up for being upset most of the time, even if you eventually get the goal. If you didn't enjoy the process, 95% of the time you're doing something you don't like to reach this goal. And guess what? Once you're there, a lot of times that enjoyment only lasts for so long, and then your brain kicks in and you start looking for a bigger, better goal. And so you're back to doing things that you might not even like or enjoy to get to these goals, which are ephemeral and very short term. So a big question for people, though, as you were saying, is how do I find my purpose? And the first thing I say is you don't find your purpose, you create purpose. But it is true, you need an inkling of what to start creating or building purpose around. And what I call those are purpose anchors. So we very much have to find these anchors in our life, these things we want to build purpose around. And in the book, I actually talk about 4 or 5 different ways to do this. One of the first is one that I mentioned in my first book, Taking Stock, which is called the Life Review. So the Life Review is a series of questions that we ask people at the end of life in hospice that helps them review their life. We ask them things like, what are your biggest achievements? What were your biggest goals? What were your biggest failures? Who are the important people in your life? And especially in the dying, we often ask, what are your regrets, knowing that you only have a certain amount of time left? By asking these questions in a dying person, a lot of times we help them come to terms with it, but they're a little disappointed, especially regrets, because they no longer have the agency to do anything about it because they're on their deathbed. But if you take this concept of regret and you bring it to a young, healthy person who has years to live, then regret actually is just another name for purpose. And so the life review, especially focusing on regrets, can help us start looking at what are some possible purpose anchors in our life today by focusing on those places where we came up short, where we think we could do better. So that's one way, is the life review. But there are a lot of other ways too. In the book Taking Stock, I also talk about the art of subtraction. A lot of people are stuck in a job they don't like, and they have no idea what purpose looks like in their life. And the first thing I say is, well, look at a list of all the things you do in your job and let's subtract everything out that you don't like. Is anything left on that list? Like, is there any day that you go to work that you actually get excited and show up joyful because you know you're doing a certain activity, even if you don't like most of work? Is there something that you do enjoy? When we subtract everything out, what's left? For me, that's what I found with hospice. I didn't like being a doctor on most parts, but what I did like when I subtracted everything out that I didn't was this hospice work, which I decided to keep because I would do it even if I wasn't being paid for it. So that's how I knew it was a part of my purpose. It was a good purpose anchor to build purpose around. So the life review, the art of subtraction. Another great way to start thinking about purpose anchors is the joys of childhood. Like a lot of times before we grew up enough to be told what job we should have or what an adult looks like, little kids have all these joys, these things that they really like doing, and they lose those over time. But a lot of people, I'll say, look, go back and imagine your childhood bedroom. What were the posters? What were the trophies? What were the things you collected? A lot of times we find actually purpose anchors in people's past, things they gave up as they got older because they were told that their expectations were to now get serious and move on. And so the joys of childhood is another place to find purpose anchors. And last but not least, I often talk to people about the spaghetti method. So if nothing's working and you can't find any purpose anchors anywhere else, you try the spaghetti method, which just means you throw a bunch of stuff up against the wall and see what sticks. That means saying yes to things you normally don't say yes to. It means hanging out with people you don't normally hang out with. It means doing things that might make you feel a touch uncomfortable. But it's a good way to expose yourself to new things and see if any of them spark any bit of joy. And so those are some really easy ways to start thinking about purpose anchors. But again, those anchors are the beginning. Then you have to build a life of purpose around them.
So to come to the age-old question, can money buy happiness?
So I think we have great evidence that shows that money cannot buy happiness. And people argue with me about this all the time. And here's why. There are a number of great studies about money and happiness. Most people point to, I think it was a 2013 study by Kahneman and Deaton, where they did these studies. And at the time, they said that, money brings happiness up to about a salary of $70,000 per year. But after $70,000 a year, it doesn't necessarily improve happiness. So then this guy named Killingsworth came along, and I think it was 2017 or 2018, did his own study, and he said, well, not exactly. There's some people who actually do get more enjoyment from making more money. Finally, Kahneman and Killingsworth worked together and took a look at all the data again and came up with the pretty much same conclusions that Killingsworth did. It's not everything, and the amount of happiness doesn't go up as much as you'd expect, but in some cases, more money does bring more happiness. Here's my problem with these studies. these studies, the original Kahneman data was taken from data collected for something else. I think there was only one assessment of income. So it wasn't like changing income over time. It was just one income assessment. And it was a retrospective study. It was a snapshot of one moment in time. And even the Killingsworth data was literally, they sent text to people like every day for multiple days for a few weeks in a row and collected data. And again, there was only one assessment of income. So this wasn't changing income over time. It was really a snapshot. Compare that to what I think we should all be paying attention to, which is the Harvard Developmental Adult Health Study. This study started in the early 1900s. It tracked Harvard students, ended up tracking them for 70 years. Not only tracked them, but then about 1,500 of their family members. And then they grabbed about 400 people from the Boston area as controls. And they literally did questionnaires of these people every 2 years. They did EEGs, they did MRIs, they did blood tests. They interviewed people's families, and they did this for 70 years. And they collected all sorts of data, including income data. And after 70 years of this huge study, they concluded that happiness is not related to income. It's not related to general wealth. It's not related to your job or your achievements. And I'll tell you a secret here, it wasn't even related to purpose per se. What they really found after all these studies is that happiness is related to interpersonal connections, interpersonal relationships. Now, I would make the argument that the best way to get towards interpersonal relationships is through little p purpose. When you do things that light you up, that make you happy and are purposeful and make you joyful, you're going to be like a moth to the flame. People are going to be attracted to you because you're going to be shining brightly, and you're going to form connections. You're going to become teacher and student, mentor, mentee. You're going to collaborate. And this becomes the interpersonal connections, which I think eventually leads to happiness. But the point of all this is the studies about money and happiness kind of get blown away, in my opinion, by the Harvard Adult Health Study, which is just longer, better data, and it appears to be much more accurate.
So would you say the opposite is then not true? It's still, even if you have like abject poverty, it's still happiness is still derived from interpersonal connections?
So interestingly enough, there have been plenty of studies that show that people in poverty, if you have a whole community in poverty and you give the whole community money, that improves their happiness for short periods of time, and then they fall back down to the baseline. So I don't know whether it's money or even being in or out of poverty that makes people happy. Unfortunately, what probably makes them happy is comparatively. So if you give one small group a bunch of money and lift them out of poverty, but not everyone, then you will find an increase in happiness. So I think it's really hard to connect money to happiness one way or another. Certainly in American society, it is harder to be happy when you have no money, no question about it. And that might somewhat be the comparison game, because you're always looking at all those people around you who do have money. But as far as money bringing you ultimate and true happiness after a certain point, it's probably unlikely.
For people that are listening to this and perhaps living paycheck to paycheck, you kind of go through what resources are available to them to maybe go find their purpose that would help them become happy. Can you go through some of those resources that might be available to them?
Yeah, I mean, this is the privilege discussion. I've heard lots of people, whenever I have this conversation, people come up to me and they say, well, easy for you to say, right? You come from privilege, you're a physician, you're financially independent. That might be your reality. And so you can really concentrate on purpose. But the truth of the matter is, there are people out there who are in poverty. There are people out there who don't have it as good as you. They're working their 9 to 5. They're just trying to make ends meet. How can you tell those people to find purpose? And so the argument I make, and I usually give an example, the mistake that most of these people make is they confuse money as the only tool available that helps us find purpose. So it is true. Money is a great tool, and money allows us the freedom to buy things, to make our life easier, to give us extra time to start thinking about things like purpose. But it's not the only tool. There are other tools we have. So we have our youth, we have our energy, we have our communities, we have our passions, we have our skills. And so when you take a young person, let's say you take a 22-year-old, they just finished college, they couldn't find a job. They end up working at a 9 to 5 or an 8 to 6. They're just making enough to survive. And they're looking at me and saying, well, easy for you to talk about purpose, but look, I'm just barely making it. But I would argue that, yes, you don't have a lot of that tool money, but you're 22, so you've got a lot of energy, which I don't have anymore because I'm 51. You're not married. You don't have any kids. You don't have a mortgage. And so you have some tools that I don't have. So maybe you do have to work your 8 to 6 Monday through Friday, but you have some time on Saturday and Sunday. And because you're young and you have this tool of energy and you have some passion, maybe you can find a side hustle you like doing, something that's purposeful, something that you get excited about, and you do that for 6 months. And let's say you make a little money there. Excellent. Not only have you spent a few more hours a week doing something purposeful, but you've made a little bit of money. Maybe that gives you some margin. Maybe your 8 to 6 becomes a 9 to 5. Maybe your Monday through Friday becomes a Monday to Thursday. Maybe you even get better, make more money, and you can go half time at this job you don't like and spend the rest of your time doing something that both is purposeful and that makes you money. That's the perfect scenario. Let's say you do this thing on the weekends that you're passionate about and it doesn't make you any money. It's a side hustle and it doesn't do much for you. Well, at least then you've now spent 3 hours a week doing something purposeful where normally you wouldn't have been doing something purposeful. So it's true, you haven't fixed your 8 to 6 or your 9 to 5, but at least you're bringing more purpose into your life. So I really try to help people see the other tools that are available. And a lot of people tell me I don't have enough time. Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has done the US time study year after year after year. And generally, they found that your average American has about 5 hours of free time. And to say, well, poor people have less free time doesn't hold up in their study. They actually find that people at lower socioeconomic strata tend to have a little bit more time than people at upper socioeconomic strata. Strangely enough, people who make a lot of money tend to, you would think I make a lot of money, so I have more free time, but it works the exact opposite. People who make a lot of money actually end up requiring more work and fill their time more to keep up with making more money. So the point being is that we all have some of these tools available and we have to start using them even if we are not where we want to be socioeconomically. Now, of course, some people have really hard lives and they're very stressed. And so I generally think of it as we have about 3 different tools, right? We have the art of subtraction, we have the joy of addition, and then when all else fails, we have substitution, right? So if you can subtract things from work that you loathe to try to build a better life. If that doesn't work, you can try to add things on. Remember doing that side hustle on the weekends, adding something joyful into your life. And if all else fails, can you substitute? So if you hate your job, you come home, you cook, you clean, you take care of your kids, you go to bed exhausted, you wake up every morning and do the same thing over and over again, and you're working Saturday and Sunday also, and you have no other tools at your disposal, then can you at least look at your job and say, how can I substitute? Maybe I hate my boss, so let me see if I can do the same job in the same company, but work for a nicer boss. You don't like your project? Maybe I can work on a different project. You don't like your company, but you like what you do? Maybe you can switch companies. It's not perfect, but through addition, subtraction, and substitution, how can we build just a little margin in our lives to start doing purposeful things? Because when it comes down to it, you have a set allotment of time in this life, and we have no control over it. Time passes no matter what you do. You can't buy it, you can't sell it, you can't change it, you can't trade it. It passes. The only thing you can do is try to have a modicum of control of what you do during that time, the activities you fill your time with. And so we got to do our best. It's our life calculus is to slowly get rid of things we loathe, increase the things we love, and do it over and over again every day. That's our job. We do it the best we can, but subtraction, addition, and substitution are tools that we all have along with money if we're lucky. But if we're not lucky, all those other tools, our passions, our age, our youth, our energy, our communities, our skills, all of those are also tools to make that calendar look a little better.
So I mean, it's like I don't know. I feel like I listen to you talk and I just immediately start thinking about my own life and things that I would like to get rid of in my my own job. I'm sure Jack, you thinking back to your own time working, but I mean, you talked initially about your own struggle with burnout, and I guess I don't know if you just had to estimate. This is sort of like an abstract question. Like, what percentage of Americans would you say either would want to, I guess, feel burnt out in their job, would want to switch, or haven't like accurately, I guess, figured out really what their, I guess, little p purpose is?
I think a lot of people struggle with this. And so American society often tries to tell us what we're supposed to strive for. In fact, American society often tells us what purpose should look like. And usually it's because they're trying to sell us something, right? So if you go on Instagram or TikTok and look at the influencers, they're trying to sell us the six-pack abs. They're trying to sell us the travel all the time. They're trying to sell us wearing the best clothes, being the most athletic. And if you look at the American marketing the American marketing system, they're trying to sell us on all these images so we buy their things. And so basically, we are a group of stressed out people who are told we should be striving for these big, audacious things that most of the time we cannot succeed at, right? No matter how much I want to, I don't know if I have the genetics to have six-pack abs, nor the energy or time to eat right, work out as much as I need to. And I don't even think I'd enjoy all those things. But these are the messages that we're constantly being fed. And so what do? We realize there are all these big, audacious things we can't accomplish. So we double down on work. We try to make more money. We tell ourselves if we just make enough money, we're going to all of a sudden feel good. We're going to live up to all these images that we're seeing. Or if we just double down at work, we're going to finally feel enough, even though the rest of the world is telling us that we aren't enough because it wants us to buy something. And so this leads to a huge epidemic of burnout. I mean, people are all striving towards these big, audacious things that are very, very hard to achieve. And when they're not achieving them, they're convincing themselves that feeling enough means being extra good at work or making lots and lots of money. So then they double down on that. And I think it leads to a lot of unhappiness. We're spending a lot
Another
of time doing things we don't like doing.
another interesting point that I hadn't really thought about much was you talked about how people should not have other people be their purpose. Like you hear a lot of times, breadwinner father says, my purpose is providing for my family. So what's wrong with that type of thinking?
So there are two reasons I think that doesn't work. And I think it's noble. First and foremost, it's noble. This idea that you want to live for your children is great. And I love the sentiment. And we love our kids and our parents and our friends. And so it feels comfortable to say that people should be your purpose. But there are a few things wrong with that. One is, even if people are your purpose, they grow older or change and move on. And so instead of working on something you have agency over, which is you and your passions and your joys, you're putting everything in a bucket that's outside of you, which you have zero control over. That's first and foremost why I don't like it. But something even more important, and I especially say this to parents. So if you are telling your kids by your actions that they are your sole purpose in life, what do you want their sole purpose to be? Because a lot of us look at our kids and we want our kids to have these passionate, joyful lives where they do things that light them up. But the best way to do that is to model that behavior for your kids yourselves. So if you want kids who are going to be passionate and joyful and do things that light them up and things that they're excited about, then you have to model that behavior so they learn it from you. I call that generational growth. We often talk about generational trauma. Our parents have these traumatic issues and we hand them down to kids, and the kids carry that trauma and they hand it down to their kids and so on and so forth. So we're really great at talking about all the bad things we hand down. But when it comes to purpose, we can also hand down generational growth. We can teach them to do things they love and they find joy in, and we model that behavior, and then they will do the same. So if you don't invest in yourself and your own sense of little p purpose outside of just them, your children, you're never going to give them permission to live truly whole and full and joyful lives themselves. And guess what? If I hand down to you, my child, this vision of taking care of your children is what it's all about, and you never get married, don't find a spouse, aren't able to have children, what are you setting up that child for? What are you modeling for them? And so I like the idea. I love that we take care of our families, but I think you actually serve them better by pursuing little p purpose. And I'll give you a small example of why. My maternal grandfather, who I never met, loved math. That was his little p purpose. And because he loved math, he became a CPA and he modeled that behavior for my mom. And my mom tried on that identity, decided she loved math, and became a CPA. And when I was a little kid, I had a learning disability and I couldn't read. I was really bad. I was way behind everyone else in my class. I really felt bad about myself, but there was one saving grace. I was really good at math. So while I was behind in reading, I had taken on my mom's identity of loving math and I became really good at it. And it was the thing that convinced me that I would be okay. That's generational growth. I got that because my maternal grandfather didn't spend all his time saying, I need to take care of my children. He did that. But he also said, I love math. This is my job. I find joy in this, and I'm going to pass this down. That's generational growth. I'm a better person because of it. That's what we want to give to the next generations. That's what we want to give to our friends. That's what we want to give to our family members. And so that's why I think if you just focus on people being your purpose, you leave something on the table that shouldn't be there. We should be creating more.
I guess like do you when you talk about that, do you run into people like sort of arguing like from a biological perspective that I mean like the point of life is to just pass on your genes? Like we did, I don't remember what episode it was, but we did The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And I mean, I feel like that was his end, one of his end points is
Yeah.
that the point of life is just to procreate. Like
So if there wasn't a consciousness, I'd be with you there. So if I said to you, the point of life is to procreate, and the minute you procreate and have a child, you won the game, you're going to be happy for the rest of your life, and everything is going to be great, that would be perfect. We all know because we have brains, and our brains have this thing called consciousness, and consciousness causes us to think deeply about things that just having a child will not solve all your sense of happiness, your sense of well-being, your sense of connectedness. So whereas there may be a biologic perspective where your main goal in life is to pass on your genes, we are sentient thinking human beings and we're going to experience this life. And whether you find a sense of little p purpose or not will change how you experience this life and whether you find some joy and happiness. And so both can be true. Our biologic perspective can be that we need to pass on our genes, but we can also be thinking human beings who have to live this life and think our way through it and find some sense of connectedness and happiness on top of just having children.
I guess on the generational wealth and generational trauma, you also go through kind of money scripts that are passed on from generation to generation. Can you give us a glimpse into what those money scripts are and how those get passed down?
Yeah, Brad Klontz and Ted Klontz, father and son duo financial therapists, came up with this idea of money scripts. And money scripts are basically generational trauma. Our parents and their parents went through money trauma and developed maladaptive behaviors that they then hand on to the kids. So there's money avoidance, right? Some people had bad experiences with money or they had a family member who had a fortune and blew it. And so they convinced themselves their coping mechanism is to convince themselves that money is bad and having money is bad. So every time I get money, I need to get rid of it because I don't want to be like poor Uncle Joe, hundreds of years ago who ruined the family fortune. And so we pass on these scripts unwittingly to our children, and our children see us interacting with money in this way. And just the opposite of generational growth, where our parents model great behavior, with these money scripts, they model bad financial behavior, and we allow that to become our narrative, and it's passed on from generation to generation. And so these are maladaptive things. And the only way to really get past that is someone has to break that generational trauma, recognize that these money scripts don't serve them, and start changing the way they do things.
could you give an example? Like, what would be, I feel like I've sort of talked about this with other people before, but what would be like a way to break the cycle? Like how, if someone is like stuck in one of these I guess, maladaptive behaviors. Like, do you have any advice on how to, I guess, change or stop or pick up better behaviors or?
So this gets in the realm of the difference between meaning and purpose that we talked about at the beginning. Meaning is our understanding of our past. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Money scripts and generational trauma is basically these maladaptive scripts that we've developed from childhood through the actions of our parents or through our lived trauma, right? So what happens is we see our parents doing things that's maladaptive. We make a story about life based on that, and then we carry that story with us. And so what happens is if you really want to break that pattern, you have to recognize the maladaptive story and go back and rewrite it. It's something called narrative therapy. This idea you go back, you look at your life stories and take away the guilt, the fear, the anxiety, and separate yourself from the bad thing that happened to you and prescribe a different or a new sense of meaning to what happened. And so I can give you some examples, right? So in my life, my father died when I was 7. And because of it, I decided the way I was going to fix this cosmic problem was I was going to become a doctor like him. So I had the sense that I did something wrong and it was my responsibility to fix it. That was a maladaptive story. It was a traumatic event and a traumatic event that I carried with me. My sense of meaning was I was a victim, something bad happened to me. And so then I had to pay a certain penance for that bad thing that happened. Now, the way I had to break that traumatic story was to go back and reassess it and realize that I was just a little kid. I was a good kid. I did nothing wrong. My dad died, and it was just a bad thing that happened to me. And I was doing the best I could. And so I became a doctor and I tried to make up for this. It was actually a very heroic story, not a traumatic story, not a sad story. It was a heroic story, how I became a doctor, helped people, but eventually had the strength to realize that wasn't serving me anymore and to move on. And so that was my traumatic story. We tend to get these stories handed down from generation to generation to generation. So it may be if I hadn't addressed some of this trauma when I had kids, I might have started modeling that behavior for them. That if they wanted to be important, to do the right thing, if they wanted to be good kids, they would have to become doctors too. And so I could have pushed that trauma and I could have given that to them and then forced them to start doing the same things I did, which is they would have built their own narrative around being a doctor is something that's really good. That's how I prove that I'm enough. I should be a doctor like my dad. And they would be pretty much right in straight line from that trauma of the death of my father. I would be passing it on right to them. So instead, I had to rewrite that narrative, tell my self a different story, and realize that I could step away from this thing that wasn't serving me anymore. So it's narrative therapy is really the thing that helps us work on these maladaptive scripts that we get handed down through generational trauma.
Were there any resources that helped you with this narrative therapy, like any books or along the way that kind of helped you see that you did need to change the narrative?
So there are therapists who practice narrative therapy, right? And there, if you go look it up on Google or even read it in my book, there's all sorts of steps you can take to start rewriting these narratives. I think I did it naturally. I think I was very introspective and thought a lot about the stories that made up my life. And at some point, I made the decision to start telling myself more heroic stories. So instead of feeling like a victim, I started to feel like, wow, look what all this did for me. And so, yes, I ended up in a place where I didn't love my job and I was burned out, but I didn't feel a victim. I felt that I had lived through such wonderful things and had such wonderful experiences. And so now I was facing difficulty in my life, but instead of feeling like I didn't have agency over that, I felt, oh, I've been through hard things before and I came out well enough. I can now have agency to change this and change the story and build a life that's different. And so for me, I think it was more intuitive. But yeah, that's a lot of people get this from therapy. That's what a lot of what therapy is when you go see a therapist, it's revisiting some of those traumatic narratives of your past and trying to rewrite them in such a way that breaks that generational trauma or breaks that lived trauma and allows you to move on and not pass it on.
I guess just somewhat off topic, but I feel like I hear when I turn on the news, I hear like victim mentality all the time. And it sounds like what you're describing is like switching internally from like that type of mentality to like a positive mentality. So I'm assuming that you would obviously say that this is a great benefit to the young person. I guess just why would you, I mean, do you have any idea of like why do you think we focus so much on this type of mentality in society when it's so detrimental? Like, I mean, I know it's sort of off topic to the book, but just I guess your own personal thoughts.
Yeah, I lost you for a second. I think your question is why people have a victim mentality when it's not helpful. Was that what your question was?
Yeah, it's like why do why does society focus so much on having a victim mentality when it's so counterproductive to their own well-being?
I think a victim mentality is natural because we all have trauma in our life. And one thing I've learned through talking to lots and lots of people is I've met people who've lost family members, who've been abused, who've been raped, who've seen family members killed, horrible trauma, right? And then I've seen people who will tell you that a great upbringing, loving parents, but they remember that time in fifth grade when the kids all made fun of them and they felt ashamed. It's a funny thing. Every person experiences trauma the same, regardless of how severe it is. And so there are people who objectively, we would say you've had severe trauma in your life. And then there are other people who we'd say subjectively, you've had a little trauma in your life, but not so severe. But since we only have our own lived trauma, we don't have anything to compare it to. So everyone experiences trauma in a sense the same, and it feels severe and scary and hard and has huge effects on us even if objectively we would say one person has severe trauma and the other person doesn't, strangely enough, we all experience it pretty much the same. And so all of us have some type of trauma. Some people, it seems like really, really big trauma, but lots of people have kind of the smaller traumas, right? Not that anything horrendous happened to them, but they felt ashamed and sad or worried or went through some things that still impact them today. And so given how we all go through trauma, I think the victim mentality is big just because every single one of us goes through some of this trauma and lots of us never get over it. Lots of us never deal with it. Lots of us never do this narrative therapy, go back and rewrite those stories. And a lot of people see their current success or lack of success, specifically lack of success, because of that trauma. So they feel victims to their past. And look, if you look at a swath of any community, only a small percentage of people are happy. I think the rest generally would look at their lives and they tell them a story in which at least there is some sense of being a victim. So I don't think it's that surprising that victim mentality is so common out there in society today. I think every single one of us have had some type of trauma. And regardless of whether it was big or small, it's the only trauma we know. It's the only trauma we've experienced. And a lot of us are still struggling with it as adults to come to terms with it.
In terms of how to act going forward, and we've read a couple books along this vein. We've read Sad Truth About Happiness. We've read Ikigai.
Hmm?
In terms of how we should act or think about this, I mean, if I just said my motto going forward is to minimize future regret, what would you, well, how would you view that statement? Is that a proper way to go through life?
Yeah. So again, I think regret. That has a little bit of a negative tinge to it, but I completely understand. But I think regret is just another name for purpose in young and healthy people. So I think what you're really saying is my goal moving forward is to live a life of little p purpose, because I think minimizing regret and living a life of little p purpose are very similar. Now, not all little p purpose comes from regret. It can just come from other things and things you like. But regret minimization is a reasonable response. And I think the best way to do that is to focus on little p purpose.
I guess sort of, I feel like you've sort of talked about this, but if you were to, I mean, I feel like we talked about like so many people are somewhat unhappy in their jobs. I feel like often the first step, like knowing that you need to switch is like the hardest thing to come to terms with, and like knowing what to do. If you had to give advice on someone who was maybe unhappy with their job or they wanted to change, like what would you say to them?
So I think first and foremost, instead of focusing on being unhappy with your job, I think it's better to start doing some of that work on those purpose anchors and figuring out what would look like joy to you and what would look like little p purpose. And once you have some idea of the things you would like to be doing, then we can go back to the job and say, okay, how do we take this thing we loathe and use those tools we were talking about, art of subtraction, joy of addition, and substitution, to align our lives more with that little p purpose and get rid of as much of that stuff that we loathe. So you don't like your job. Is there a part of your job you really love? Right. And some people are going to say no. And some people are going to say, oh, yeah, there's this thing I do every Thursday. It's the only time I love my job. Well, without doing anything else, maybe you can take on more of that responsibility and relieve someone else of it. Maybe you can become the guy who does the file sorting every Thursday, but guess what? Other people do that on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. Maybe you can take over more of that file sorting, which you really enjoy, and let go of some of those things that you don't love. Maybe you can change bosses because it's the boss you don't love. Maybe you can stay and work for the same company, but do something different within that company. Maybe you can move from one company to the other. Maybe if you can't do any of that, that's all substitution. Maybe you can start working in your free time. Remember, we said your average person has 5 to 6 hours of free time a day. Maybe you can start building little p purpose into your free time. And it doesn't necessarily have to change the fact that you are required to go to your job to make money, but at least now you had time in which you weren't doing something purposeful in, and you can start doing purposeful things in. That is the joy of addition. We talked about the art of subtraction, getting rid of things you don't like at work, the joy of or the ability to substitute, changing things in from one job to the other, from one task to the other. I think all of these are our tools, and add those to our other tools that we talked about, not just money, but our joys, our connections, our relationships, our skills. We actually have a lot of tools in our tool belt that we can start using to make that life feel better, regardless of whether we like our job or not. And so it's really looking big picture, feeling that sense of agency, and moving away from what you hate and starting to try to figure out what you like, and then slowly modifying your life to be more of those things and less the things you loathe. It's a continuing process, and we're always working towards it. And so as you get older and wiser, you want to be filling more of that precious time you have with things that feel purposeful and less of that time with things you loathe. But it doesn't start on day one. It is a slow process that you continuously do, I would say, until the day you die.
So I think this will be my last question. But Jordan, right now, what would you say is your little p purpose?
Oh my God, I have so many of them. So I love writing. I love the process of writing. Put me down, I put classical music on and I start writing. And it is one of the most joyful things I do. I love podcasting. Put me in front of a mic. I don't care if that podcast goes to 1 million people or 2 people. I just like doing it. I love exercising, like something that's just for me. I love going on long walks. I like reading. In fact, I have so many types of little p purpose. I don't even have time to pursue them all. When I was a kid, I loved baseball cards. For the last 10 years, I've been saying I got to get back to baseball cards. I just don't have time. And that's fine because right now it's not a priority because I have public speaking and podcasting and writing books and hanging out with you guys and going to conferences and exercising and reading. And I mean, this is the thing. Little p purpose is so abundant that if you can open your mind to what it is, I challenge you to have trouble filling your day. And I do coaching. And a lot of the coaching I do, we go through exercises where we develop these purpose anchors. And then we build what I call climbs, which are activities around these purpose anchors. And we fill out a schedule. And hands down, usually people's schedule has them doing something like 70 hours a day. And it's just not possible, right? Because you go back and you realize there's no way I could do all this. Purpose is very abundant. And I think that's what I'd really like to leave you with, is this idea that we've had this scarcity mindset when it comes to purpose for so long that we have to start really looking at it as abundant.
Okay. I think that's probably a good note to end on. That was a very optimistic, last statement. I guess, Jordan, if you want to give people, I guess, just a plug of where they can reach you at. That would
So the
be
book is
great.
The Purpose Code. It comes out January 7th. The best way to reach it is to go anywhere books are sold, especially if you're online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc. If you have any questions, you go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. There you can see where to buy both of my books, Taking Stock as well as The Purpose Code, as well as all the places I create content. So it's the Earn and Invest podcast. I have a Substack called The Purpose Code that goes along with the book, as well as a financial podcast and a a financial blog and a healthcare blog. All of those are on jordangrumet.com.
Awesome. So with that said, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. For the original episodes, the OGs, please visit brothersonbooks.com. I am Jack Allweil, and with me, as always, is my brother Alex Allweil, and with special guest Jordan Grumet. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.